What are you doing here? I work here. I'm a doctor. Someone called, said you look suspicious. I'm Dr. Malcolm Rivers. I work in the ER. Doctor? You don't look like a doctor. What do you mean by that, officer? How do doctors look?
The morning sun glinted off the Denver General Hospital parking lot, but the glare couldn't hide the tension about to erupt. Dr. Malcolm Rivers, exhausted from a 12-hour night shift, walked steadily toward his car. His navy scrubs were neat, a hospital logo embroidered on the chest, his ID badge clipped securely with his name and title clearly visible, and a stethoscope hung around his neck. Nothing about his appearance should have drawn attention. Yet, as he reached his car, a police cruiser screeched to a stop nearby, tires skidding slightly against the asphalt. Officer Vincent Calloway jumped out, his body camera already recording, his posture aggressive, his gaze fixed on Malcolm like a predator spotting prey. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Calloway barked, his voice harsh and breathless. Malcolm froze, momentarily startled. His tired body stiffened, and he turned slowly to face the officer. "I work here," he said calmly, though his eyes betrayed growing irritation. "I'm a doctor. Someone called, said you look suspicious. I'm Dr. Malcolm Rivers. I work in the ER." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Doctor? You don't look like a doctor." The words hit Malcolm like a physical blow. He had spent 23 years becoming a physician. He had saved lives, worked endless hours, guided interns and residents, and built a career from the ground up. And now, in the middle of the hospital parking lot, a man with a badge was telling him he didn't look like a doctor. Before we continue, I need to ask, where are you watching from? Take a moment to drop your city in the comments, and if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this need to be shared, and your support keeps them coming. Malcolm adjusted the stethoscope around his neck, trying to remain calm. "Officer, I am a doctor. I've been practicing for 23 years. I just finished a 12-hour shift in the ER. My badge is right here. You can see my name, my photo, and my title. What about this situation makes you think I'm not a doctor?" Calloway took a step closer, the body camera shaking with every movement. "I need to verify your employment." "Stay here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Verify my employment. Look at my badge. You see the stethoscope. You see the scrubs. You can ask anyone inside. I am not staying here to be interrogated because someone thought a black man in hospital scrubs looked suspicious." Calloway reached for his radio, pressing the button. "I'm going to call for backup," he muttered. Malcolm, refusing to escalate the situation, pulled out his phone and dialed hospital security. Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived, followed closely by Thomas Brennan, the hospital administrator. Brennan's face was a mix of disbelief and fury as he approached. "Is he a doctor?" Calloway asked, still focused on Malcolm. "Yes, that's Dr. Malcolm Rivers. One of our best ER physicians. He's been here 10 years, Brennan said sharply. "Why is he being detained?" Lieutenant Sharon Hayes, who had been called in from a nearby precinct, arrived and immediately assessed the situation. Her eyes flicked to Malcolm, then to Calloway. She had reviewed the officer's history before -12 complaints over 8 years, all following the same pattern. Black professionals stopped, credentials questioned, escalation despite visible proof. She recognized the chaos instantly. "Dr. Rivers, I apologize," Hayes said firmly. "You are free to go." Malcolm exhaled slowly, trying to control his simmering anger. "I've been practicing medicine for 23 years. I just finished a 12-hour shift. I have my badge. My stethoscope is here. I am standing in the hospital employee parking lot. And your officer told me I don't look like a doctor. Not that my badge is fake, not that my credentials need verification. You just said I don't look like a doctor. Based on what?" Hayes turned to Calloway, voice low but sharp. He's wearing a hospital ID badge. Calloway shrugged. It could be fake. It's not fake. The hospital administrator just confirmed he's a physician. He's been here 10 years. The caller said. I don't care what the caller said. Calloway snapped. You see someone in scrubs with a badge in a hospital lot. You verify the badge first before confronting them. You don't tell them they don't look like a doctor. The confrontation had drawn the attention of other staff leaving the hospital. Some stopped to watch, murmuring amongst themselves. The body camera captured every second. Calloway's aggression, Malcolm's controlled fury, the administrator's disbelief, and the mounting tension of an incident that should never have happened. Malcolm filed a formal complaint that afternoon. He included everything: body camera footage, witness statements, the administrator's confirmation, and the timeline of the officer's repeated targeting of black professionals. This wasn't the first time. It was the 13th documented incident following the same pattern, ignored each time by supervisory staff. As the internal investigation began, the pattern became undeniable. Each previous complaint had ended with training or workshops that changed nothing. But Malcolm's case had evidence too clear to dismiss. The Denver Police Department faced a reckoning. That Tuesday morning in the hospital parking lot had started like any other, with a physician finishing a shift, heading home to rest. But it ended exposing a systemic failure that allowed racial bias to persist unchecked. The confrontation was more than a personal attack. It was a case study in prejudice, oversight, and the cost of ignoring repeated warning signs. Malcolm's story was about to change the course of a police officer's career and force a city to reckon with the consequences of ignoring bias. The moment Malcolm walked away from the parking lot, the tension didn't fade. It only shifted. Officer Vincent Calloway was immediately placed on administrative leave, badge, and radio in hand. The body camera footage was already turning into a viral sensation within the department. Supervisors replayed it over and over, grimacing at the clarity of his bias. Meanwhile, Malcolm returned inside the hospital, exhausted but determined. He didn't just want an apology. He wanted accountability. By noon, Malcolm had compiled a formal complaint that was meticulous in every detail. Every word he had spoken, every movement, every utterance of Calloway's, every witness, every second of the body camera footage was documented. He included Thomas Brennan's statement confirming Malcolm's employment, the hospital security logs showing their timely response, and the timeline of Calloway's 12 previous complaints, all strikingly similar, all ignored. The internal affairs investigator assigned to the case, Detective Marissa Cole, had been with Denver PD for 15 years. She was meticulous, methodical, and unafraid to hold officers accountable. Within the first hour of reviewing Malcolm's complaint, she noticed the pattern immediately. Calloway had been confronted about racial profiling 12 times before. Each time, the complaints were dismissed or minimized. Each time, he attended the required workshops but continued his behavior. And now, complaint number 13 was undeniable. Detective Cole scheduled interviews with everyone involved. She began with Lieutenant Sharon Hayes, who recounted the scene exactly as Malcolm and the administrator had described. He refused to recognize any of the visible evidence of Dr. Rivers' credentials. He didn't see the badge, didn't see the stethoscope, didn't listen to Dr. Rivers' explanation. He made a decision based on race, Hayes said, her voice steady but clearly frustrated. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern, and it's been allowed to continue for years. Next, Cole interviewed Thomas Brennan. He was still visibly upset about what had happened. I've worked in healthcare for decades, he said, and I've never seen an incident like this. Dr. Rivers was clearly on hospital property, clearly in uniform, clearly identifiable as a physician. For a police officer to tell him he doesn't look like a doctor, well, it's beyond comprehension. And to think this has happened 12 times before with other black professionals, it's a systemic failure. Finally, Cole spoke to hospital security, who had been the first to arrive on site. They described Calloway as agitated, defensive, and dismissive. Even when we confirmed his identity, he still questioned Dr. Rivers' legitimacy, one officer said. It was like he didn't want to believe a black man could hold that position, even with all the proof right in front of him. After 9 weeks, Cole's report was complete. It painted a damning picture. 12 prior complaints ignored, visible evidence dismissed, racial profiling clearly documented, and deliberate indifference from the department. Calloway had violated every standard of professional conduct expected of an officer. The findings shocked the command staff. Calloway was immediately terminated. The letter of termination didn't mince words. Officer Calloway engaged in racial profiling of a physician wearing hospital scrubs, a hospital ID badge, and a stethoscope in a hospital employee parking lot. He stated, "You don't look like a doctor," despite visible evidence proving otherwise. This represents the 13th documented complaint following an identical pattern over 8 years. Your continued employment poses liability for the city and violates civil rights. Employment is terminated immediately. Calloway's termination sent ripples through the department. Other officers, some of whom had witnessed his behavior, whispered in corridors, incredulous that this had finally led to a career-ending consequence. Yet, outside the department, the story was just beginning to gain traction. Local news picked up the story within days, framing it as a shocking case of racial bias in professional settings. Malcolm, meanwhile, began preparing for the next phase, federal litigation. He knew the city would not voluntarily admit fault or make the damages right without legal pressure. The lawsuit named Calloway, his supervisors who ignored the repeated complaints, and Denver PD itself. The allegations were clear: racial profiling, unlawful detention, emotional distress, violation of constitutional rights, and deliberate indifference by supervisory staff. In the weeks leading up to the lawsuit, Malcolm returned to the ER. Every shift was a reminder of his purpose and of what he had endured. Colleagues offered unwavering support. Nurses and doctors who had witnessed his professionalism for years expressed their outrage at the harassment he faced. The hospital administration publicly condemned the incident and immediately implemented protocols to prevent police from questioning staff identity without proper verification. Malcolm's reputation remained intact, but the memory of that morning lingered like a shadow. The intense dialogue from that morning replayed in Malcolm's mind repeatedly. The simplicity of his statement, his name, his title, his ID badge, his stethoscope, was met with disbelief and condescension. Calloway's words, "You don't look like a doctor," were not just a challenge to his identity, but an outright dismissal of decades of education, service, and professionalism. Malcolm knew the stakes were higher than personal dignity. It was about the systemic neglect that allowed someone with 12 prior complaints to continue unchecked. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The body camera footage left no room for ambiguity. Malcolm's documentation detailed the history of complaints, the repeated failures of the department, and the immediate impact on his mental and emotional well-being. The city's lawyers struggled to defend the indefensible. Every attempt to minimize the incident crumbled against the unassailable record. Finally, after 14 months, the city settled. Malcolm received $950,000. The sum was one of the largest settlements in Denver history for racial profiling of a professional in a workplace setting. But for Malcolm, the financial settlement was secondary to accountability. The real victory was the acknowledgement that the department's repeated neglect had tangible consequences. Denver PD implemented sweeping reforms in response. Automatic investigations triggered after 6 similar complaints within 6 years. Mandatory supervisor review of all stops involving professionals in work settings. Quarterly pattern analysis for any officer challenging credentials of professionals. Early warning system for officers displaying bias in verification. Command staff accountability for supervisors who fail to act on documented patterns. mandatory body camera review for all interactions with visible workplace identification. These reforms ensured that no other black professional at Denver General or anywhere in the city would be treated like Malcolm. The confrontation that had started as a simple act of bias became the catalyst for meaningful systemic change. Malcolm's story spread beyond Denver. Medical schools used the footage to teach students about racial bias. Civil rights organizations highlighted it as a textbook example of how assumptions based on race can override visible evidence. Police academies included it in training sessions to emphasize accountability. One 10-minute confrontation had not only ended a police career, but changed protocols, created awareness, and highlighted the human cost of unchecked prejudice. Through it all, Malcolm returned to his true calling, saving lives. Each shift in the ER reminded him of why he endured the scrutiny, the harassment, and the bureaucracy. He remained a mentor to younger doctors, an advocate for systemic fairness, and a living example that professionalism, integrity, and persistence can bring change even against entrenched injustice. The courtroom was tense the morning Malcolm Rivers took the stand. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but outside, the story had already made headlines. Journalists lined the hallways, discussing the shocking nature of the confrontation in the hospital parking lot. Inside, Malcolm's presence radiated calm authority. He was the same man who had faced Officer Calloway months earlier, calm, professional, and unyielding. The city's legal team tried to downplay the incident. They described it as a routine verification of credentials and implied that Calloway had acted on a reasonable suspicion. But the evidence told a different story. 12 prior complaints, ignored or dismissed, all with the same pattern. Body camera footage showing Malcolm standing in hospital scrubs, badge visible, stethoscope around his neck, calmly asserting his identity. Witness statements from hospital security and administrators corroborating every word. The narrative they tried to force, reasonable suspicion, collapsed under the weight of reality. During testimony, Malcolm described the emotional toll of the incident. I had just finished a 12-hour shift in the ER. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I walked into the hospital parking lot, just trying to get home. And suddenly, an officer confronted me like I was a criminal. I showed my badge. I showed my stethoscope. I gave my name. And he said I don't look like a doctor. That moment was humiliating. It was not just about me. It was about every professional of color who has to prove their legitimacy, even when evidence is right in front of them. The judge listened intently. Questions from Malcolm's attorney were precise, cutting through the city's attempts to minimize the event. Every pause, every look at the evidence, reinforced the pattern of bias. Then the attorneys presented the most damning piece, the record of Calloway's previous 12 complaints, each involving a black professional with visible credentials, each escalated unnecessarily, each resolved superficially. Calloway's defense was feeble. He claimed he was following procedure and concerned for security, but when asked directly about telling Malcolm he didn't look like a doctor, his responses faltered. Well, I don't know. I was just. His voice trailed off. The body camera footage, shown again in slow motion, captured the moment perfectly. Malcolm standing calm, confident, professional, while Calloway's assumptions drove the interaction. The settlement negotiations began shortly after the trial opened. Denver city attorneys, facing the clarity of the evidence and the potential for widespread reputational damage, offered a settlement, $950,000 to Malcolm Rivers. The figure shocked many, but Malcolm accepted it not as a victory of money, but as a victory of accountability. The settlement was accompanied by a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to systemic reform within the department. Denver PD immediately enacted sweeping changes. Officers with patterns of bias were flagged for intervention. Supervisors were held accountable for ignoring complaints. All interactions with professionals in workplaces were now subject to verification protocols. Body cameras were reviewed regularly, not just during complaints. The early warning system identified officers showing bias, and command staff had to respond proactively. It was the first time in Denver that such a systematic approach had been implemented, all because one black doctor in uniform refused to be silenced. The city's settlement didn't erase the humiliation Malcolm faced, but it sent a message. It told professionals of color that their legitimacy cannot be questioned based solely on race, that systemic bias has consequences, and that institutions can be held accountable when they fail to act. The $950,000 was a milestone, but the reforms it forced were the lasting victory. Malcolm returned to Denver General Hospital, continuing his work in the ER. He still treated trauma patients, guided interns, and made life or death decisions daily. Yet, the experience changed him. He became more than a physician. He became a symbol of resilience and accountability. His colleagues supported him throughout, witnessing firsthand how courage and meticulous documentation could confront entrenched bias. The story of Malcolm Rivers became a case study. Medical schools used it to teach students about racial bias, assumptions, and the importance of advocacy. Civil rights organizations highlighted it as an example of systemic negligence and the cost of ignoring repeated complaints. Police academies analyzed the body camera footage to demonstrate the consequences of unchecked bias and the necessity of accountability. One brief encounter in a hospital parking lot had changed policies, education, and awareness across multiple sectors. Meanwhile, Calloway's law enforcement career ended permanently. The termination letter, the record in the National Decertification Index, and the public scrutiny made it impossible for him to be rehired by any department. Attempts at private security work failed. Eventually, he left Colorado, a stark example of the consequences when repeated bias is ignored. Malcolm spoke publicly about the incident after the settlement. Through his attorney, he said, "I'm a physician. I've dedicated my life to saving lives. I've worked 12-hour shifts, treated thousands of patients. I was in a hospital parking lot, clearly identified, and told I didn't look like a doctor. This isn't about one officer or one day. It's about a system that allowed 12 complaints to go unaddressed over 8 years. Accountability matters. And when ignored, it comes at a cost. $950,000 is what it costs when institutions fail to act." The story resonated far beyond Denver. It inspired conversations about racial bias in workplaces, particularly for professionals of color. Organizations began reviewing internal policies, asking whether visible proof of identity should be enough, and recognizing that assumptions about legitimacy can have profound consequences. For Malcolm, the personal impact was clear. He had turned humiliation into change. He continued to mentor younger doctors, ensuring they knew their rights, understood the value of documentation, and could navigate professional challenges with integrity. His legacy became twofold: saving lives in the ER and saving dignity for those who face prejudice simply for existing in their professional roles. The morning confrontation that should have been routine ended as a powerful lesson in accountability. It proved that even deeply entrenched bias can be confronted, patterns of discrimination can be exposed, and change is possible, even against decades of neglect. Malcolm Rivers' courage and perseverance didn't just win a settlement. It created systemic reforms, awareness, and a path for others to follow. One man's insistence on respect and professionalism turned a humiliating encounter into a landmark moment for justice. And the $950,000 settlement, while symbolic, reminded the city, and every institution watching, that ignoring patterns of bias is costly, not just financially, but morally and socially. Denver's police department changed its protocols. Officers learned that visible proof of professional identity could not be dismissed. Supervisors were reminded that ignoring complaints has consequences. And for Malcolm Rivers, every shift, every patient saved, every trainee mentored became a statement. Professionalism, courage, and accountability cannot be undermined by prejudice. This is the story of a black doctor in uniform who was harassed in a hospital parking lot, who faced blatant bias and who turned a single confrontation into lasting reform. It's a reminder that systemic change is possible, but it requires courage, persistence, and an unwillingness to accept injustice as inevitable. Malcolm continues his work today, an emblem of resilience, proof that standing firm against discrimination, even in the face of exhaustion and personal risk, can reshape institutions and protect countless others from facing the same humiliation.